not available for young people trying to find suitable and affordable places to call home. Today we'll be hearing from two government bodies with responsibility for housing policy. With me today are other members of the committee, who I will now ask to introduce themselves.
I'm Aidan Clark.
Hi, I'm Rihanna Zaman.
And I'm David Cowan.
Thank you for attending today. Could you please introduce yourself and the capacity in which you're appearing?
My name is Kinnish. I'm a member of Legislative Council, but I'm also the political member for the Division of Public Estates and Housing, which is part of the Department of Infrastructure.
Would you mind telling us why the Minister for the DOI cannot be with us today?
Unfortunately, it's off island.
Thank you. Your department has responsibility for affordable housing. How does the department define affordable?
Properties that people can afford within their income thresholds.
And do you think the definition is fit for purpose?
I think you have to regard the definition or the income thresholds as continually evolving, because of course nothing ever goes down in price, everything always goes up. So provided that we are mindful to the evolving nature of income thresholds, then I think you can keep your eyes fixed on that definition, provided the policy that sits behind it moves in line with that definition.
So when you're developing policy, what assessment does the department make of the requirements of young people, and what data is used to back up these decisions?
I probably can't give you the exact information on that, but what I can do is ask the officers to report to you with the detail that helps them inform that. I think when you look at any policy development, you're being informed by the needs of your society. So where there's more evidence of needs in relation to particular groups, then that policy will examine those needs and apply that. With regard to the way the current affordable housing policy has been developed, I mean, the current policies with regard to, for example, the first home choice and first home fixed, they were established back in 2014, which does precede me somewhat in my political career, which only started last year. So I couldn't give you a definitive answer as to what they've looked at in terms of data to inform that policy, but I could certainly ask the officers to look at that and inform the committee in writing to you.
Thank you.
And do you feel that these policies do reflect the housing need in the Isle of Man?
I think at the moment there is an income threshold review. So I think when you have a shortage of supply, that always puts pressure on house prices. And of course, as house prices rise, then incomes don't necessarily rise at the same rate, and then you've got a mismatch between those two. So the department at the moment are in progress with an income threshold review that's been driven in part by the Housing and Communities Board, but also by other political influence. So that, as I understand it, is going to be delivered to the Register of Business at Tynwald imminently. And I think there's a number of processes to go through. Council of Ministers, for example, decisions have to be signed off. If everything goes to plan, that income threshold that paper would come to Tynwald, I think, in early to mid next year with the new thresholds.
And following that threshold review, do you think the policies will be fit for purpose, or do you feel that they require further reform?
Is there a particular aspect of the policy that you're thinking of?
Not specifically at this moment in time, just that we've heard from a lot of island residents that they don't believe the policies are fit for purpose. Now, obviously, if you feel that an income review will kind of solve those issues and will make it usable by people, and you think that is the main issue with it, then...
Yeah, I think with the income is one of the biggest issues.
Yes.
That's the one we hear about the most. I mean, for example, I recently saw evidence in relation to an individual who'd been on the register for the first time buyers register, that is, for nearly 2 years, and then had income increases in salary, and then that meant that individual wasn't then eligible to purchase on the first time buyers register, but didn't earn enough in order to buy without any additional support. So I think that's just an example as time progresses that that sort of movable feast of salary doesn't necessarily match the schemes, so it's important to try and keep the schemes going. I think one of the difficulties is when you're changing policy, it takes such a long time to take that policy forward that it doesn't always keep pace with what the needs of the market are. But certainly working closely with this division and also the commercial division of the DOI, which I'm responsible for, you can see a number of developments that are coming through. So one of those policies for affordable housing units is that a certain number of those units developed have to be given as affordable housing units. Now, if the developer doesn't agree that, perhaps it's a development that's not suited to first-time buyer properties, then they agree what's called a commuted sum with the department, and that commuted sum is then paid over to the department. What I can tell you is that there is a work ongoing looking at how to utilise those commuted sums, what's in the fund, in order to develop more affordable housing units.
Okay, thank you.
So can I just ask, on regards to the commuted sums, what are they currently being used for?
I can't give you a definitive answer if any of those funds are currently being used, but I know that there is a sum in that fund, and that's what they're looking at the moment, is what they can use those for and how can they use that towards affordable housing units.
And do you know, just a scope of how often the contractors and developers are paying the commuted sums instead?
Again, I don't have specific data between different developers as to who's paying a commuted sum. Again, I could ask the department to break that data down for you in a written answer. But I do know, for example, there's a number of developments. I think I've got some of them written down here. So I think there's, 20, 30, 40, there's about 55 developments sort of ongoing or near completion, which are all brand new developments, which will be affordable housing units. There has been an initial planning decision for a development at Braddon, but that could be appealed, of course. And within that planning consent is 80 affordable housing units. So that's quite a significant number of affordable housing units coming through. And when you look at the first-time buyers register, I think currently there's 223 households sitting on that register.
So just now you're saying that they're going to be trying to build more affordable housing. Are young people incorporated in your assessments, and do you think that the assessments provide an accurate representation of the demographic for housing needs?
So when you say assessments of...
what kind of housing that you should be building?
Okay. I mean, when the first choice fixed scheme offers apartments which are one-bedroom apartments, or a two-bedroom house or a three-bedroom house, and of course the allocation of those will be dependent on what that household or individual needs to qualify. So of course, a single person wouldn't be considered for a three-bedroom property. So they will look at what the individual's needs are before making an assessment whether that's right for them. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Are you trying to increase the number of apartments and flats? Because in Jersey, 2011, 44% of occupied properties were flats, whereas on the Isle of Man, only 17% of occupied properties are flats in 2016.
Okay, that's quite interesting data. I think if you make a comparison between Jersey and the Isle of Man, Jersey is a much smaller place to live in terms of its landmass. So, of course, it's a natural instinct for them with having a much higher population. I think that's around 105,000 currently. So there would be more need to build upwards as opposed to outwards, given the size of Jersey compared to here. I think if you look at some of the planned developments, and of course there's the government policy within the Island Plan around development of brownfield sites. A lot of those brownfield sites are being considered for development of flats. So I think what you will see is a shift in that data that you've got currently, looking forward, that I think that will grow the number of people who will be eligible for flats or living in flats at that time.
So the department are in favour of building more flats?
I think when you've got to look at and I think in May 2024 there was the objective assessment of housing need was completed, and that came to Tynwald. When you look at that, there's much more demand for owner single occupied properties. So I think when you look at what the need is, you've got to meet that need. So there's definitely an increasing demand for people who want to live on their own as opposed in couples or families.
And when you say there's an increasing demand, do you mean within ages like 18 to 25, or are you talking of more of an older demographic?
I can't say definitively from that objective assessment of housing need. I think people who are more likely to be single are more likely to be younger initially. But also, as you get older, you're more likely to see individuals on their own, people who've been widowed, etc. So you'll always see a demand at both sides, I think, for single, but that's not to say that people throughout their lifetime may have a need as a single residency. But I can't say definitively whether that data in the objective assessment housing need looked at particular age groups. But I've got a feeling in my head it did, but I don't want to say on record that is the case.
Thank you.
Okay, so just to move on to look at the private rental sector. Obviously, in 2021, Tynwald passed the Landlord Registration Private Housing Act. What progress has been made by the department on introducing the regulations under this act, and how has this been prioritised?
Okay, so that obviously, as you know, that particular piece of legislation was there to make a mandatory registration requirement for landlords, and that was there also to enforce minimum property standards, and I think that's quite a hot topic, to be fair. And also some civil penalties and enforcement around that. It also intended to bring in an occupancy deposit scheme. What I can say is that it is on the legislative plan within the department to do this work, but due to competing interests within the department and various other high priority projects, unfortunately that piece of work hasn't had the same level of priority attached to it. I have been advised that the next steps in relation to that work for developing the framework, in particular for the occupancy deposit scheme, is by the end of June 2025, and then to have consulted upon the minimum standard regulations within that same time frame.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask, why does the department not feel as if this is as a high priority as other matters?
It's not that the department doesn't feel that it's a high priority, but I think the department has to be led by competing objectives within some of the strategic plans. And just to put this in perspective, there is just one legislative officer within the Department of Infrastructure who has responsibility for a very large number of legislative changes. So the demands are on that one officer to create all of these different regulations. So a priority has to be made, and unfortunately when you look at those priorities you're looking at wider strategic objectives that feed into that.
Okay, and do you mind giving us some examples of those wider strategic objectives if possible?
Well, I think when you look at the island plan, for example, the department is responsible for bringing forward all the marine infrastructure management regulations under the Marine Infrastructure Management Act, and that's obviously going to feed into the offshore wind projects. So there's a lot of work going in relation to that at the moment. But again, there's other legislative priorities in the department. But I think, they've given a commitment that they will look at particular aspects under that legislation, and they've given a time frame. So I think that's a positive step forward.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just quickly, you were saying about the high priority things are to do with more of the island plan. But one of the features of the island plan surely is to try and increase the population. But if we're not trying to enforce more regulations for landlords, which most young people at the minute are renting, surely we need to try and retain the economically active and incentivise them to stay.
I think, are you talking about people who are perhaps been on the Isle of Man a number of years, or are you talking about people who we're attracting to bring and whether that they will stay on the island?
Well, in both cases actually, but young people. Okay. Like say people who have just been to university or people who have just graduated.
I think if you're a returning student, then there's a number of schemes that, through the first-time buyer schemes that can support you in getting suitable accommodation. But if you're looking specifically at the private rental sector, because I think this is what your focus is at the moment, then I think everybody's aware that there's such high demand on the private rental sector at the moment. It's trying to get accommodation in the first place. But I think what we need to bear in mind is the work that's going on at the moment. So, for example, the work with the Manx Development Corporation, that's going to supply a number of private rental sector accommodation. There's more social housing being built currently. I've already touched on a number of private developments that will feed into the market. So I think the more supply that we can put in there, particularly for people to be able to buy their own properties, that will then take pressure off the private rental market as well.
Some people that we've spoken to feels as if the current policy for the Landlord Registration Act has failed them because private rental accommodation that they're in has either been mouldy or not of a good enough standard for the cost. I'd say, in their opinion, it's impacting their health, so surely that would be deemed as a high priority thing.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's existing legislation that can support tenants. So there is legislation under the environmental health laws that can support people in those situations. So, it's about reaching out to the environmental health officer to come and check those properties and work with those bodies and agencies to try and do something about the standard of the accommodation that they're in at present. So I wouldn't say that waiting for this legislation is the be all and end all. I said there is other legislation, existing legislation, that can help support those people in those situations.
And you said that there's only one person currently dealing with this as a whole. To enforce this policy, would you say it was at the top of your priorities and it was the next thing to be done, would you say that it would take a long time to enforce the policy?
To enforce the policy, so
for the office to process it and...
Okay, so as it is at the moment, the Act is in force, but the regulations that sit under that Act, the secondary legislation hasn't been drafted.
Yeah.
So it's...
so for that all to be complete?
Well, I think that's the commitment they've given here to me, is that the developing that framework for the occupancy deposit scheme is by the end of June 2025, and then they want to consult on those minimum standard regulations within that time frame. That doesn't mean that those regulations will be ready by June 2025. They would obviously then have to go through the relevant process. I'm not sure whether that Act requires those regulations to be approved by Tynwald or laid before, but there still is a process after that consultation for those regulations to come in force. So, I wouldn't say that June 2025 is the deadline for that. It will be beyond that.
Thank you.
Now, in your answer to my initial question, you mentioned that the minimum standard requirements are quite a hot topic within the department. Do you mind just elaborating on that?
I think it's, if you're looking at social media and, you keep abreast of what's in the media, it's easy to see that individuals do have difficulty, particularly on social media. You'll see evidence, and personally I've seen situations where accommodation isn't of a standard where, I wouldn't want my children to be renting properties of that standard. So I understand there are difficulties, and I understand that this legislation can make a difference, but the department's has got a commitment to deliver it, but it's just, again, as I said, it's about the priorities and the pressures on the department to do that.
Okay, so it's a hot topic in terms of prioritisation, not in terms of what the standards would actually be.
Well, that's where the consultation comes in.
Okay.
So the consultation will look at what those minimum standards are and look for feedback on that.
Okay, thank you. So you couldn't advise on any kind of estimations of what sort of minimum standards you'd enforce at this time, or
no,
that would be entirely reliant on public consultation?
No. So what the department will do, they will put out a number of minimum standards and ask for feedback on those standards. That's normally they'll sort of put some policy principles out there and then ask for feedback on those. And they may even draft the regulations in a draft form, but I'm not quite sure how they're going to deliver that. But I've got what I'll do. I'll ask the department to write to the committee and confirm whether or not there is already a set of minimum standards that they are going to propose in the regulations, because I'm not sure whether it sits in the Act already or whether it's something that they need to develop as part of that consultation, but I'll get them to give you a definitive answer.
That'd be excellent, thank you. I know it's not in the Act already, but if they have got any kind of drafts or anything, that would be brilliant if you could supply them. Thank you. And in kind of reply to that consultation, you're obviously going to get two sides, that the landlord saying that they need to be lower and the tenant saying they need to be higher. Do you know how those responses would be weighted? Would they be weighted equally? Would the tenants be given higher weighting as they're the ones that are actually living with the conditions?
I couldn't answer that, I'm afraid, David. I don't know. They would have to just look at the consultation as a whole and determine, I think that what you need to do is encourage as many tenants or people who would be tenants to respond, because that will then show that the bigger need versus those who are maybe letting properties. Yeah.
Completely understandable. Thank you.
Just quickly, has the department spoken to young people in rental properties about the standards of their accommodation?
I couldn't comment on whether the department has directly spoken to young people about the standards of accommodation. I think the housing division will receive feedback, not necessarily within the housing division for private rental. If there's an issue going on with a public sector rental, they'll get that feedback that way. But with regard to the private rental, I would doubt very much that would come directly.
Do you think that the department is making too many commitments for projects and policies if there is only one officer?
That's a very good question. I think the department's a big department. Only last summer there was a process undertaken looking at the department, what they do, whether the department should be responsible for all the priorities that it has to deliver, and whether the department should be shrunk down in order to facilitate delivery of what they need to deliver. So that is still an ongoing project. Some areas are being moved into other departments, but I know that project is ongoing.
I'm only saying this because if the department's making many commitments for years ahead, you could argue that it's giving people some false hope.
I don't think it's giving people false hope. I think that what they're trying to do is give a realistic time frame. I think if they were to say that they were going to deliver it by the end of this year, that would be giving false hope, but they've given quite a definitive time frame as to what they can deliver in relation to that Landlord Registration Act.
Okay. And do you know, or does the department have any ideas about how the Landlord Registration Act will be enforced, how those minimum standards will be enforced upon landlords?
Well, I don't know the detail of it, David, but as I understand it, there's a number of civil penalties and enforcement set out in that primary legislation, so it will be dependent on what it states.
And what about an enforcement body? Who would be responsible for enforcing them?
Does the Act create an enforcement body?
Not at this time, no.
Okay, so it depending what's delivered in the primary legislation as to who would be responsible for enforcing. Yeah.
Okay, right.
So I'd just like to go back to your point about the current standards, such as environmental health. Now, we heard from someone who's living in private rental accommodation who said that they were having problems with black mould, damp and cold in their home. Now, they did contact the Environmental Health Agency, who sent round an officer, and the tenants insist that the officer recorded unsafe levels, uninhabitable levels of mould and stuff in their home, yet it was still deemed safe. Do you think this shows that current legislation is failing tenants and therefore the Landlord Registration Act should be a higher priority?
I think you do raise a really valid point. So if it's identified, I think one of the things is if that's identified and people's living conditions are identified like that, often if they're on other waiting lists or other properties, that can then increase the points allocation when they're sitting on other waiting lists in order to offer maybe something that's more suitable. In terms of the ability of the environmental health legislation, the enforcement aspects of it, I wouldn't be able to comment on, effectively whether that's got teeth and how effective it is. I think if you think about the fact that they've brought this landlord registration legislation forward, I think it's just trying to capture the fact that there may be some omissions in the legislation as it stands. But yeah, I mean, it is something that the department wants to deliver, but again, as I've said, it's about the priorities and resource that's available to the department at the moment.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll now be moving on to the topic of home ownership and the first-time buyer schemes. Your department is due to report back on the home purchase assistance schemes this month. What exactly have you been reviewing, and can you share any of your conclusions with us yet?
So when you talk about the home purchase assistance scheme, so this is the first choice fixed scheme and the first choice the first home choice scheme and the first home fixed schemes. The reviews that are taking place in relation to those are, as I understand it, to do with the income thresholds, and so that will be the information that's going to be put on the Register of Business for Tynwald, and the words imminently were used by the officer. So we should see something coming forward shortly around those income thresholds.
Okay, thank you. You told us in your submission that the thresholds for the shared equity purchase schemes are based on the median salary in the Isle of Man. Can you please elaborate on why this measure was chosen?
Unfortunately, I can't tell you why that measure was chosen in the first place, but I think it just gives you a good starting point because it allows you to look at the statistics. So it allows you to understand what people's earning thresholds are at that particular point in time. But the difficulty with picking a point in time is that things evolve and things change. So people's salaries change and salaries move, and house prices change and house prices move. So again, I think that's the point I made at the beginning, was it's an evolving process that you have to be mindful of, and you need to move with that at all times. But so I think when you see, if you were to look back at what that initial salary threshold was back then, it's completely different what the needs are right now.
Okay. The 2023 Housing Market Report shows that the median salary for 18 to 25-year-olds is significantly lower than for the general working population, making home ownership difficult. Is it your department's policy that people this age should not be trying to buy a house?
I wouldn't say it's the department's policy that people that age shouldn't be trying, because I think when you look, they've given me some statistics here, and I think they supported, since the introduction of the fixed and the choice schemes, 82 households have been supported into first-time buyer home purchases. So I don't think it's the policy. I think the policy includes 18 to 25-year-olds. I think the difficulty is when you start out your career, obviously you're starting at the bottom of salary thresholds, and you're going to develop over time, be promoted, salaries will increase over time for you, and therefore that then makes it more affordable when you're getting a mortgage. I think most banks at the moment probably factor 4 times salary at the moment. I think maybe something that's not known to people, and particularly young people. I've got 4 children. My eldest is 19. If I was to ask my 19-year-old what options there are for first-time buyer properties at the moment, he wouldn't be able to answer me that question, because it's just not something that is considered at this moment in time. And it's lovely for him. He's living at home, and he's obviously not feeling that need to go. Perhaps I should furnish him with that information, let him consider it. But I think sometimes maybe the messaging is not out there for that age group, and not understanding what those schemes are. So, for the shared equity purchase schemes, I don't think necessarily everybody understands that you can get up to 30% help with your equity that then can be used towards your deposit. So often when you're young, many, many years ago I was young, and I remember it was very difficult to save for a deposit. You've got other outgoings, you're paying your rent, you're paying your bills. Where do you find anything in your salary to pay to save for that deposit? So I think that's where there is value in those shared equity purchase schemes, that it does allow people to effectively use that contribution from the department towards a mortgage and towards that first time purchase.
So do you believe there's a lack of education and awareness for young people around these schemes?
Yeah, it could be that there's just a lack of promotion of the schemes, and perhaps not enough young people know about it. I think if you look, when you look these numbers that I had for first time buyers register, 223, that's quite a small proportion of people looking for first-time buyer properties. So perhaps the communication and the promotion isn't as known as it could be.
Okay. What is the rationale behind allowing first-time buyers' homes to be sold on the open market, and do you believe that this just decreases the available stock?
It's a really good question, that one. So of course that is the policy at the moment. Is it the right policy? Does it need review? Maybe it does. I've heard quite a few opinions recently around that. I think sometimes when you look at other jurisdictions, they don't necessarily allow those first-time buyer properties to go onto the open market. They may say you can sell it at 20% back to the government body. So maybe that's a policy that we need to review in order to keep a stock of first-time buyer properties. But the current policy obviously is as open market. That policy, I recall, did change. So I think originally, when it was the house purchase assistance scheme, you had to keep your property for 10 years before it could go on the open market. I think the scheme has changed to 5, but perhaps that needs another review.
Is there any scope to take the applicant's age into account when setting income thresholds, and what change would be needed?
So to take an applicant's age into account, well, I think applicants' ages are taken into account when they look at the scheme. They have allocation criteria, so the ages are taken into account.
Okay, thank you.
So just before we move on to the mid-rent project, earlier on, I'm just going back to the questions on the Landlord Registration Act. Is the department worried about breaking relationships with current landlords?
I couldn't comment on whether currently they're worried about breaking relationships. I am aware that a body of landlords set up, and I think there was what I can describe as discontent by some landlords around that legislation. But as far as I'm aware at the moment, I've not heard anything recent about that, so it's not a statement I could make because it's not something that's within my knowledge.
Thank you. You told us in your submission that only 3 out of 18 households in the mid-rent scheme went on to buy their first home. Why were more households not able to save up enough for a deposit?
So the department did have some feedback from applicants who said they were unable to save a deposit. As you're aware, the mid-rent scheme was based in Colby. And for some people, they were working in Douglas, and they found that the additional cost of fuel travelling to and from those properties impacted on their ability to save for a deposit. That's the only feedback that I have had in relation to that from the department and feedback that they received. But I mean, something that crossed my mind with mid-rent is during that period of the mid-rent scheme on the Isle of Man, interest rates rose quite significantly. And if you're saving for a deposit and the interest rates are much higher, of course your repayments are going to be much higher, and that then in turn makes it more difficult for individuals to then get the mortgage that they need. So I'm not entirely convinced it was entirely about saving for deposits. I think in terms of timing, the way the interest rates were on the market has impacted on the ability for people to buy properties.
When the mid-rent scheme project started, did the department believe that it was going to be a successful scheme?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you start any new scheme, you hope that it will be successful. And of course, for three out of 3 households, it has been successful. I know that's quite a small number out of 18, but, that's 3 people who have been helped onto that property ladder. I think never say never, but I think what the point is that the department are looking at lots of alternative ways of delivering affordable housing. I think, I watched the session that you had last week with the gentleman who came from the Chamber of Commerce think tank, and it was quite interesting to hear, going forward, should we be thinking about developments that are all about masonry, or should we be looking at alternative style properties, where they redevelop containers, and I follow something called Tiny Homes Community. Maybe we need to be thinking a little bit differently about how people get onto the ladder. I don't think mid-rent would be the only thing. I think for mid-rent to come back as an option going forward, the legislation would need to come in, because this was done as a pilot, and they were able to do that as a pilot within the legislation that they had, but to deliver it as an actual scheme, that would have required a legislative change.
At what point did you realise it was starting to fail, and why were no plans put in place to try and rectify the failure of the scheme?
I couldn't tell you definitively when the department realised that the scheme was failing, but of course when you get the mid-rent you have it for a period of time. Once you come near to the end of that period of time, then you'll be contacting the tenant to see whether they're at a point to be able to buy their own property, and it's at that point you're getting the data back, and you understand that some of these occupants have not been able to save the required deposit to move out of the property and purchase their own. So I think it would have been an ongoing set of data collection that would have then informed them that this scheme wasn't successful.
So it wouldn't have just been near the end?
Well, I mean, I think, once that they had a number of properties, a number of tenants that all went in at the same time, but then of course some would have moved out, other ones come in. So I don't think you could say it would be all at the end, but that would have been a data set that would have come in at different times, and that would have then informed the department whether this has been successful or not. I mean, those particular properties at the end of the tenancies will be allocated to the public sector housing scheme, so that will then afford some social housing.
So were the failings not taken into account when creating the scheme?
I think at the start of the scheme, a mid-rent scheme is not it's not unique to the Isle of Man. Other jurisdictions have started mid-rent schemes and still have mid-rent schemes running. And I think when you look at the rent, it is more affordable than what you're going to find on the open market. But the scheme had a particular purpose, and that particular purpose was to allow those households to save for a deposit. And then if that's not working, I think the other thing to reflect on is that, and the department reflected on, is was Colby the right place for that scheme? And I think if they were to do that again, I think they'd think about putting those properties in a different place.
You say that the scheme offered housing at 80% of private market rent value. How was the private market rent value determined?
I did have the answer to this, just bear with me. It was done on the basis of a government valuation. Now, I don't know the factors behind that government valuation. I did see some figures for what they regarded as open market rent. When I looked at those figures, I think once they'd done the deduction, it was in the region of about £500 to £600 a month as the rent. And that has changed over time. So as some people have moved out and bought their own property, the government value has then changed the valuation because, as we know, rents went up during the period of this pilot. So the rents, I think, went up to in the region of about £700 to £800.
What lessons have been learnt from the mid-rent housing project that can be applied to other schemes run by the department?
I'm not sure that you can sort of cross-fertilise the schemes, really. I think every scheme that you have has to stand alone. So I think when you look at the mid-rent scheme, you know, I think they have looked at that scheme and they've thought, well, what has worked with it, what didn't work, you know, why didn't it work? And they've decided that it didn't work in the current format that it had, but they've, as I've said, they've committed to looking at different ways of delivering affordable housing units, but at this moment in time, not through a mid-rent project.
So would you not say that a lesson that was learnt was maybe the planning of a scheme? Would that not be transferable to another scheme?
Sorry, Alex, what do you mean by that, planning of the scheme at the outset?
Yeah, like when you were first starting out with the mid-rent project and you believed it to hopefully go on to be a successful scheme and you were making all the plans for the mid-rent project, reflecting on that, was there nothing that you could take away when you were going to go and plan another scheme? I'm not saying specific to housing, but I'm just saying as a department, a lesson.
Well, I think it's always important to reflect back on anything that you've delivered and to learn from that. And I think that was part of the rationale for bringing this scheme to an end. It was reflecting on whether it's worked or not, because I don't think there's any point continuing with a scheme that's not effective. You know, we need to, as I said, everything evolves and you need to look back and see what's the most effective scheme for the needs of your population. And I think that's what the department's reflected on, is that hasn't met the needs. It hasn't been as successful as they would have liked it to have been. Yes, there are some factors that maybe at the outset maybe shouldn't have been. Like I said, was Colby the right place? I think the department reflected and said, no, I don't think it was the right place. But again, there's learning from that. And I think if you're thinking about affordable housing units and different schemes in the future, all those factors can be considered. So yeah, I think there's always learning. I think you always need to reflect and then apply that.
Do you know why Colby was chosen?
I don't actually, no, but I can ask the department to give you an answer to that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to move on to public sector housing and the proposed housing association. So firstly, could you please explain to us how income thresholds are set for social housing, what measures are used and why?
Okay, so income thresholds are done in consultation with the local authorities. And once that consultation has taken place, it will be brought into the legislation. So there's the public sector scheme, which has to come to Tynwald, so it has to be approved in Tynwald. So I think there was one last year that came in. I can't remember the exact month. I've got July in my head, but I could be wrong about that. And that sets out those different income thresholds. So there is a process that's undertaken. So with the ongoing work at the moment around income thresholds, the public sector one is part of that. So local authority consultation has recently taken place in relation to that. So that then feeds in to the new scheme. So that's how they're set.
Okay, thank you. So Earlier on this year, Rob Callister sent a letter to Tim Crookall criticising the thresholds, pointing out that the maximum gross annual income for joint applicants with no dependents is £38,000, which is £8,000 below if both were working full-time minimum wage jobs. Now, the department did promise back in July that it would review these. What stage of that review process are you in?
I'm very aware that Mr Callister has made this point. He's made this on the floor of Tynwald as well, as have other political members, and all of that information has fed into the review. So what I anticipate to see is that the paper that's going to be published on the Register of Business for Tynwald is the outcome of that. So yeah, very recently I had a meeting with the division, and they said that they'd had that consultation with the local authorities. So all of that information is feeding in. There was a separate briefing for Tynwald members with the housing division, and again, some of those points you've just raised there were raised within that meeting, and the officers took that information away as part of the review.
Okay, do you have any idea when the review process will be finished?
Well, as I understand it, this is the information that's just being compiled at the moment that will go on to the Register of Business. If I've got that wrong, I'll ask the officers to correct me, but as I understand that the income thresholds will be part and parcel of that.
Okay, thank you.
I'd just like to ask, how often are the thresholds reviewed?
There's not a fixed time frame for the thresholds to be reviewed, and I think you can go back and look, because it's all in an order that has to be approved by Tynwald. You'll be able to see the periods of time when each of those allocation policies have been reviewed. It's a bit unusual actually with the income thresholds, because policies are not normally statutory policies. Policies are normally what informs the legislation, but with this particular one, it's a statutory policy. So then that policy it comes to Tynwald members to be approved. So in order to bring about a change, it has to go through that statutory process. So it's a bit quirky actually to what you would normally see. Policy isn't normally sort of enshrined in any sort of statute, so it doesn't have. It almost takes away its flexibility a little bit, because in order
Can I just ask why that would be? Why was?
Do you know? I don't know. It was. I found that quite interesting when I first started my political career, because I think that was one of the first orders. I think I was elected in March, and I think that came up in July. And I remember thinking, why is this a statutory policy? But I don't know why it went into the legislation in that format. So in order to bring about the change, you have to change the order, and there's a whole process that sits behind changing legislation. So it's not straightforward. But yeah, I don't know what the timeframes have been in between changing thresholds. But you know, again, political members representing, particularly the MHKs representing their constituents, they will get that feedback from their constituents about whether those thresholds are just not meeting their needs. And so you'll often hear that politically when there's issues around those thresholds and needing change.
Okay, so many people have criticised the fact that public sector housing is not held to the same standard as private rented housing. So why has the department so far refused to hold them to the same standard by, for example, enforcing the minimum standards laid out in the Landlord Registration Act on public sector properties?
I can't comment directly as to differences in standards. I mean, the division that I'm political member for, they do respond to needs in properties. You know, if somebody something's not working, or it's broken, or there's a problem, you know, there's a team who respond to that. So in theory, those standards should be being met, but there'll always be instances when perhaps that's not happening. You know, I can't comment other than the DOI housing stock, because that's who I engage with. But you know, as far as local authorities, other local authorities are concerned, you know, they'll have their own teams who work to ensure that the properties are maintained and theoretically kept to standard. I know there's been some issues around whether public sector stock should be subject to those standards, and it's not part of that landlord registration, but that's not how the legislation's gone through. So
would the department consider enforcing those standards on the public sector housing?
What I can't answer is what are their standards currently. So that's something, again, I could ask the housing division to come back to you and say what standards they they adhere to, because there must be some standards that they work towards.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So the department began exploring the creation of a housing association a year ago. What work has been done so far on the viability of this, and when will this work be completed?
Okay, I can't give you a completion date. I can tell you that that work is progressing. We are currently at the stage of just recently a subject matter expert has been appointed in order to drive the project forward. And so in order to drive the project forward, it will be looking at different legislation and regulations that are required, how to successfully develop a housing association.
Okay.
But of course, that by having a housing association, the benefit of that is that initially what the intention is to put the DOI housing stock into that housing association. It allows the housing association to leverage financially against the housing stock, and then that in turn allows them to develop more property.
So the Objective Assessment of Housing Needs report stated that between 1,200 and 1,400 new public sector homes need to be built. Do you believe that a housing association will be able to meet this target, keeping in mind that public sector house building has fallen by 60% over the past decade under the department's previous plans?
So I think this is where a housing association would be advantageous, because, as I said, if you leverage the value of the properties in the portfolio, you get your lending on that. That then allows the development of additional homes. What I can't tell you is whether that would meet the need of 1,200 to 1,400. I haven't seen any figures in that way. I think a useful model to look at, for example, is when you look at Jersey and you look at I think one of their housing associations, Andium, is the amount of development that they've managed to do in the period of time that they've been running. So it definitely will bring more stock to the market and increase the supply.
Okay, thank you.
Just before we quickly finish, I'd just like to ask, why is there such a low social housing stock?
Why is there such a
Low social housing stock?
There's more housing stock now than there was, but I think
And just on regards, if you look over the past years, how much has been built? Each year is quite a small amount.
Okay, I can't comment on why it's been a small amount, but it has increased over time. There is more housing stock being developed. For example, there's the housing development at Williston at the moment. Lots of apartments are being built in Williston, just opposite the shops there. There are projects down at Castletown, School Hill, with additional housing stock there. So I can't comment on why it's perhaps been at the numbers, but it has increased over time, but it's probably not meeting the needs that we have. You know, we can see what the waiting list numbers are, so we know there's additional need. But I think, again, that's why the housing association is really important, because that will deliver more properties and hopefully take some of that pressure off the waiting list for public sector housing.
Thank you. That is everything from us. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I'd like to thank you for your questions. Hopefully I've answered what I've been able to, and as I said, I'll ask the officers to respond on the points which I wasn't able to respond for you. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for attending today. Could you please introduce yourself and the capacity in which you're appearing?
Yes, so I'm David Ashford, MHK. I'm Chair of the Housing Communities Board, and I've been in that position for just under 12 months now. It was October last year.
What is the role of the Housing and Communities Board and what powers does it have?
So the role of the Housing Communities Board is to bring together housing policy across government, because as you'll know from the evidence sessions that you've already taken, housing policy is split across various different departments. So there's the element of assisted housing within DHSC, some of the policy area and policy development sits in Cabinet Office, and then you've just of course heard from Mrs Kinnish from DOI, where they've got the social housing, public housing side of things. So the point is to try and bring everyone together so that we actually have one joined up policy and we don't have different areas of government going off and doing different things in the same space.
When developing policy, what influence does the Housing and Communities Board have over the number of affordable housing built on land zones for residential development?
So in terms of policy, the Housing Communities Board, the way I describe it is a policy hub. So it's technically a subcommittee of council and ministers. So it has full authority, and mine as a director, my appointment as chair is a direct appointment by the Chief Minister in the same way he appoints ministers. So we act, or any policy decisions have to come through us for censor check before they go on to council and ministers. The actual development side of it does sit in DOI, particularly when we're doing things like the shared equity schemes, which again you'll have taken quite a bit of evidence on, but we actually do get through the Housing Board before they bring forward any policies to Tynwald to be able to put input into what we believe the position should be.
So did you have any influence over the housing policy in the strategic plan?
So the housing policy and strategic plan is slightly different. If we're talking about the overall Ireland strategic plan, that obviously goes back a number of years, and the current strategic plan I think even predates the Housing Communities Board existing. The current strategic plan which is being developed, because I should say one of my other political roles is I'm also political member in Cabinet Office, which has responsibility for the strategic plan. So the Housing Communities Board will have input for the new strategic plan that's being developed for the island.
So the current amount of houses, 25%, needs to be built affordable in these developments. Do you think that that's enough?
I think it is if you get the development. And this has been one of the key things which I've spoken about in public before, which is, I'm sure, something you've heard about, the commuted sums. And my personal view is when it comes to commuted sums, it's being reached too often to say we can't provide that. Again, because I've been around the block quite a bit, a previous role I had was chairman of the planning committee, and time after time you'd see developments come forward where there'd be an agreement around a commuted sum rather than providing the affordable housing. Personally, I think that is something we need to look at and be much more defined on what developments a commuted sum can be applied for. There will always be developments where it's not practical to put affordable housing in. So a prime example is the flats being developed down in the south. That housing block, because there'll be maintenance charges ongoing and so on, it's not really suitable for a first-time buyer. So those developments I can understand commuted sums, but when you're building housing estates, we should be pushing for the actual affordable housing to be delivered, in my view.
It's good to hear that's your personal opinion. Is that an opinion that's shared by the Housing Communities Board as a whole? Is that something that wider government is looking at?
I think it is. I think it's something I've put on the radar in Tynwald many times, and I'm certainly, I think there is great sympathy in the Housing Communities Board with that as well. That would, of course, mean a change to planning policy, which is slightly wider around government. But I think one of the things that is very much accepted across the whole of government, and this is where the objective assessment of housing need, which I'm sure we'll come on to shortly, has been very key in doing, is it shows if we are to meet our ambitions, then we are actually going to need to build more affordable housing if we're going to change the demographic of the island, if we're going to have the economic growth. And people probably get sick of hearing me say it in public, but I've said all along that if you don't get housing right, you don't deliver anything else. Because if we haven't got the housing right and we're not attracting the right people in an affordable way, the government will not deliver its economic plan, it will not deliver its island plan, and it won't deliver the change and growth that this island needs in the future.
Okay. And how do you feel that it's best to deal with those computed sums in future? Do you think they should be increased to the point where they do act as a deterrent rather than simply as compensation? Do you think there should be requirements whereby they can only be paid if those requirements are met?
So I think it's actually a mix. To be perfectly honest, I think when you deal with anything like this, it needs to be carrot and stick. What you don't want to do is put it to a level where developers just won't develop, because, like I say, there will always be developments that are needed by the island but aren't really practical to have affordable housing in. And my worry is if you just did it purely on value and said, right, a commuted sum is going to be up here, a developer, say, like developing that block of flats down south, which is on brownfield land, they just won't do the development. They'll just say the money no longer stacks up. So I think it needs to be a mix of the value of the commuted sum, which I do think needs to be looked at, because my understanding is it hasn't been looked at for a good number of years, but also actually tightening the policy about when the commuted sum applies. For me, that's the absolute key, is actually defining that criteria more closely than where it's been.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you.
Would you consider ring fencing the money from the commuted sums and put that into housing?
Well, at the moment, the commuted sums money goes into the housing fund generally. So although it's a sort of roundabout way of ring fencing, it is actually ring fenced in that sense already. But most definitely commuted sums are there for development. It might not necessarily just be housing, because you may have, for instance, developments where you want to put some greenfield space in, which the commuted sums can also be used to develop as well. I spoke on Manx Radio the other day when I did the Man in Line about the fact that one of the things we need to get back to is communities. Where I live up in Governors Hill in Douglas North, when they built Governors Hill, they built a school. They built, they built a doctor's. We've got a chemist up there. They built the pub as well. So it created a sort of community hub. And I think that's what we miss from developments now, including in affordable housing developments. We need to be building a community feel. And, people always refer to the housing bit of my title, but my full title is Chair of the Housing and Communities Board. And for me, the communities bit is just as important as the housing.
Just previously and now, you're touching on the fact that we do need to build more houses, which I think as a committee would be in agreement with. But how would you go about doing this?
So I think it's got to be a mixture, because one of the things I would say is that government can't do everything. We have to be honest with that. Taxpayer resource is finite. And as politicians, it is very easy for us to go out and say, we should be doing this, we should be doing that, we should be spending here. All well and good, where's the money coming from? So I think it's got to be a partnership approach. We've got to work with the developers, with the private sector. I've spoken to some people in the development side who are very keen on different aspects of housing, maybe not necessarily aspects of housing this committee would be interested in, at the other end of the scale, sort of retirement housing and so on, and they're keen to get on and develop it. And government needs to ensure that they are able to facilitate that, and that the people aren't held back by the planning rules or the regulations around that. In terms of affordable housing, I think one of the key things is government does need to take a gamble, and they do need to actually invest. They need to be using reserve money to actually invest in bricks and mortar. Our reserves are all managed in funds. They don't just sit there in a general bank account day to day. They're invested in property funds in the UK. My view is, shouldn't we be bringing some of that money back onto Ireland and investing in property ourselves that will also create a return for the taxpayer? Just
now you're saying it's partial reason is because there's a lack of funding. Could you say that this could be down to overspending within the government? I have my own views on that, and I have made them very, very clear in relation to the fact that I worry that government is burning through money left, right and centre. I think also the problem is we have been through a pretty, as is the rest of the world, a pretty torrid time of it over the last 5-6 years. We had the COVID pandemic, which thankfully didn't cost the island as much as it could have, and compared to a lot of other places. And then we moved straight into a cost of living crisis where we had to give actual direct support to people as well. So if you look back sort of over the last 5-6 years for all governments around the world in terms of spending, it's been a pretty unique period. The only period that sort of really compares to the sort of crunch that we've had is immediately after the 2 world wars. That's certainly the only economic example I can find in recent history. So I think it's a mix of things. I think there are elements of government that could be done a lot better.
But also, like I say, I think when it comes to capital expenditure and building of affordable housing, we need to be looking to the reserves and investing potentially in our land and in our people.
When I was saying about overspending, I was more so speaking about projects and schemes which the government
Well,
has
again,
put forward, which I
got
don't know how much of an effect external factors had on it.
So, I mean, the obvious one that obviously comes to mind is Liverpool Landing Stage, which went massively over budget. But generally, most capital schemes are mainly affected by inflation, which you're never going to get around, because if you're building something over 5 or 6 years, the build cost is going to change, and most capital schemes have a contingency built in. To be honest, I don't think some of that would even touch the sides. Even if those projects had come in dead on budget, it would touch the sides of affordable housing, because if you look at the cost of building property, an average 3-bed house now to a builder in the UK comes in at roughly around about 210,000 to build. So if you build just 10 of them, that's 2.1 million. Build 100, that's 21 million you're looking for. So I think it's a bit more fundamental than that.
When developing policy, what assessment does the board make of the requirements of young people, and what data is used to back this up?
So, to be honest, in the past, the data has been rather sporadic. There's different policy considerations that we use. So one of the things we've been looking at is the different needs of young people, because in the past, and this doesn't just apply to young people across the board, it's very easy to put people into boxes and sort of say all young people are the same, all middle-aged people are the same, all elderly people are the same. They're not. So care leavers, for instance, have a very different housing need to maybe young people who are able to stay home at the family and save up for a deposit, or those that for various reasons have had family breakdowns. So one of the things we're getting much better at is engaging with other departments of government, particularly DHSC, in trying to understand the needs of the different categorisations of young people. The OHAN has helped enormously as well, the objective assessment of housing need, because that has drilled down into where we believe things are going. I don't know what definition you use for young people. I tend to use up to sort of the age of 25. I know there's always a temptation when you talk about young people to either say up to 18 or up to 21. I always try and say it's 25. So just to be clear today, when I refer to young people, I'll be referring to those up to the age of 25. And, I think that there is a broad range of factors. So the board does take that into consideration. And one of the things we've been very clear on is, I'm sure Mrs. Kinnish mentioned it earlier, the shared equity schemes are currently under review. And one of the things we want to see is, as that review comes through, how is that going to impact on the affordability for young people? Because one of the very helpful things that the Isle of Man government has been collecting as a statistic since 2010 or 2012, I think it was, is the affordability ratio for property for young people. Prior to that, it was just done off average or median earnings. And one of the things it shows is that for young people, it's a much higher multiplier, because obviously they're at the earlier stages of their career and they're earning less. So we need to ensure that we are helping more and more young people to get onto the housing ladder.
And does the board believe that the right housing stock is being provided to meet the needs of our young people? I know before, when I'm sure you only used it as an example, but talking about affordable housing, you went straight to a 3-bedroom house. Very few 18 to 25-year-olds are going to have need for a house of that nature. Yeah. The reason I went for a 3-bed house is that is the price that's available generally in the UK. They normally price off 3-bed houses when doing the average build cost. But you're quite right. But one of the other things, you've hit on something though, because one of the things that we also need to ensure when we're providing housing for young people is what I term future-proofing. So that there is attached to a house enough land to expand that house if necessary, because the temptation throughout the 90s and early 2000s was to utilise land as much as possible. So I don't want to go for the phrase box houses, that's probably not quite appropriate, but houses that didn't really have any room for expansion. And that then can trap young people in a 2-bed house or a 1-bed flat, when actually what they're wanting to do is grow a family, and they might be wanting to stay where they are, but they haven't got the ability to build that extra room onto the house or put the extra extension on. So we need to be looking at those factors as well to make sure that housing is future-proofed. And do you feel that it is a better solution to kind of make it so that those houses could be expanded rather than, for example, those first-time buyers selling on those houses as a first-time buyer house to another first-time buyer and then moving into a bigger house on a different piece of land?
Well, I think it's a mix, because I think with the schemes we're going to need a mix of schemes. So one of the things that could be looked at for first-time buyers is precisely what you've just touched on, where you have what's termed perpetual first-time buyer homes. So you don't have a situation where after 5 years you just sell it at market value, or 10 years you can sell it at market value, but instead there is a condition on it, saying that property's price will rise, but it will only rise in line with the average house price recorded each year. So that means that you haven't got someone trapped in that property that they can't ever move up because the housing market is moving more and more away from them, because you're still increasing the property price with average value. So that is one potential scheme. But also what we need to be doing as well is finding ways of not just doing affordable housing through the first-time buyers schemes, but being able to encourage and support more open market transactions as well. So there is the scheme at the moment, which I think is the choice scheme, that allows for more open market transactions, but there's not much take-up. And the reason is that generally the prices are completely out of the range of people being able to do it anyway. I think we need to look very closely at that, because as much as building new homes and affordable homes is the go-to option, I think we need to find ways to get young people into the existing property market as well. And before you ask me, I don't have off the top of my head a way of doing that, but I think that is something that we need to actually look at.
Okay, thank you. Right, just to avoid us getting stuck into a pit here, unless anybody has any other questions, I'll move on to the private rental sector, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the objective assessment of housing need, which was published earlier this year, obviously shows that 16 to 24-year-olds are by far the most likely demographic to be renting, and that they're much more likely to be renting a house than to purchase their own. What is the board doing, if anything, to improve renters' rights and improve the conditions for these young people? So
there's several approaches being taken. So obviously, and again, you'll probably have spoken to Mrs. Kinnish about this in the previous session. There is still the regulations under the Act that haven't come in yet. That's now been 4 years on. I believe DOI is moving a bit forward with that now, and they should be shortly coming forward, is my understanding, that sets minimum standards and also enforces those minimum standards. The other thing that has always fed back to me as a constituency MHK from young people is concerns about deposits and how protected those deposits are. So if there is a dispute with the landlord, am I going to get my deposit back? Or am I just going to be thrown out? And I think one of the things we're looking to develop is an arbitration scheme where deposits will be held away from the landlord, so they'll be ring-fenced effectively. And if there is a dispute between the landlord and tenant, there's an independent process that can be gone through to resolve that, because at the moment there is nothing like that. And particularly for a young person, it can be generally quite frightening trying to take on a landlord and argue the point. So we're looking at things such as that at the moment, and I believe the arbitration scheme is now due for completion in March 26.
Okay, thank you. And are you involved in the development of that arbitration scheme? You as in the Housing Communities Board?
So Housing Communities, yes, it's one of the main parts of the Housing Communities Board action plan, so it will all feed through the board.
Okay, thank you. And are you involved in the implementation of the regulations around the Landlord Registration Act as well?
So that sits in DOI, but yes, once the regulations are ready, before they go to council and ministers and then on to Timwood, they will come through the Housing Board as well for censor check.
And you will just review them? You have no influence on their actual contents? You would just approve or return them?
Yes, so DOI will draft them. Yes. The Housing Communities Board will then look at them, and I would hope, if common sense prevails, they would take on board anything we may actually suggest, because of course anything we say will also be passed to council and ministers who will make the ultimate decision.
Yeah. Okay. And how high of a priority are those regulations for you as a board? How high priority do you think they should be for government to get processed and get enforced?
For me, they are a priority because it has dragged on and on. I can't remember now because I lose track of time whether the Act was 2020 or 2021. I think it was 21. So next year we're 4 years on. And I think it is causing uncertainty in the rental market as well for landlords, because I think landlords are worrying what's in these regulations, why are they taking 4 years to draft, and that means that there's a reluctance in landlords to either enter the market or remain in the market in some respects around that.
Okay. And what are your opinions on kind of that whole thing of the possibility of scaring landlords out of the market? Do you think that that should be considered by the department? That should be considered as a real concern, or do you think that should be, do you think that tenants' rights should be the priority and that should be a secondary concern?
I think it's a balancing act, to be frank, between the two, because if you did have private landlords en masse exit a market, then there is no way of filling that gap. I'm not seeing that at the moment, I should stress that. I know a couple of landlords who have expressed concerns, certainly to me, and have potentially not invested and bought more property as they would have done. But I think the bigger challenge at the moment, which we're seeing in the rental market, because the rental market does concern me at the moment with the price, is we're seeing a lack of availability, because a lot of landlords have worked out that if they sell the property and put the money in the bank, with the way interest rates are at the moment, they're actually getting a better return than they are from the rent after you take into account maintenance and other things they have to do with the property. And I know a few landlords up by me in Governor's Hill who've done exactly that.
Okay, thank you. And following a resolution of Tynwald, the board's been tasked with establishing a method of engagement with landlords. Are you looking at considering a similar scheme for tenants, for them to engage with government directly?
Yeah, well, I think it's important we do have some form of tenants forum. I'm not sure that would necessarily be through the board. It might be through DOI or, where the policy sits in terms of the regulations and so on. But I think it is important that tenants have a voice, not just the landlords, but there has to be some sort of way of getting tenants' voice heard.
Okay, thank you. And in our previous evidence sessions, we've heard from the chair of Housing Matters, which is the charity that supports young and vulnerable people with housing needs. They made it clear to us that a lot of landlords can be reluctant to let to younger people, particularly those from lower income or vulnerable backgrounds. Does the board have any plans to address this issue? And if so, how?
So this is a concern that I've heard before. I mean, my personal view, and again it is a personal view, is that there shouldn't be allowed to be age discrimination within any form of letting. I think certainly with care leavers, perhaps there needs to be a certain amount of underwriting of deposits and so on, to try and encourage landlords. But I think as well it's an education piece, because actually, to be frank, I deal with all sorts of situations as a constituency MHK, and some of the young renters I come across, I would say, have their heads more screwed on than some of the older renters I do. So I think there's a whole education piece there as well.
Yeah, okay. And is this, I know you mentioned that's a personal view, is that something that's being pursued by the board or by government as a wider entity?
So it's not at the moment. That is my personal view. That's why I've badged it as my personal view, but no, it's not at the moment.
And is it something the board's looking at pursuing?
Not at the moment. Like I say, the important focus at the moment is get the actual minimum standard regulations in, get the deposit scheme in, and ensure that the arbitration scheme is up and running, because those are the things that we think will have more actual physical effect for renters at the moment than potentially trying to do legislative change in that way.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll now be moving on to the topic of home ownership and the first-time buyer schemes. What role did the board play in reviewing the shared equity purchase schemes?
So the board will be involved in this round of the review of it. The last time, I must be honest, predates my time as chair of the board. So the last time they came up for review, I don't actually know whether the board considered it or not. But speaking going forward, the current review that's underway, once DOI has completed that, it will go through the Housing Communities Board before going on to Council of Ministers.
Okay, thank you. The income thresholds for the schemes were based on the medium salary in the Isle of Man. However, we know that the medium salary for 18 to 25-year-olds is much lower. Did you take this into account when setting the income thresholds?
So the income thresholds are obviously set by DOI and then obviously approved by Tynwald. Again, my view is the income thresholds are not right. because they don't take into account, as you say, the difference in age, but also equally the higher thresholds for the scheme. If you look at people who can qualify for the scheme, that hasn't kept pace, because median wage now on the island, on the most recent figures, is about 38,000. So the one of the schemes is way out, even just on terms of the maximum thresholds. So I think they need to be constantly under review. And one of the things that I, for a long time, have said is one of the mistakes government makes with these thresholds, particularly where the schemes have a statutory basis, is we write the amounts into the legislation. So the only way you can then alter the amounts is by going back and changing the legislation. I've always believed legislation should actually have written in, this is the starting amount, and then each year, unless an order is moved to the contrary, it will increase by whatever measure you use, inflation, median wage, average wage. So it goes up automatically without the need to actually tinker with the legislation.
Okay, so the objective assessment of housing need makes the point that young people who cannot afford to buy a property tend to stay at home for longer periods of time than they would otherwise do when property is cheaper and thereby more accessible. Do you believe that it's fair to say that the government relies on this assumption when making decisions about housing policy?
So I think in terms of people staying at home longer, I think there is evidence of that. I remember reading something, I think it was a report from the UK, that said now the average age of people leaving home is something around about 34, 35. Which has radically changed over the years. But I don't think we should be using that as any form of assumption, because not everyone has a stable home to remain in that long. We just spoke before about the rental market and the fact that some of the biggest share of rental market is young people sort of up to the age of 25. So we shouldn't be assuming that people have got the ability to stay at home and save up deposits. Any policy should be based around focusing on that individual themselves and their needs.
Okay, thank you. On your webpage, it says that the board has overseen plans for increased charges for non-owner occupiers and the introduction of fees for non-resident buyers to help reduce housing market pressures. Could you please provide an update on these plans and when they might be brought in? So
at the moment, the plan is for, in both of those, it hopefully to be next year. That we'll be able to make movement on that in 2025. That will, of course, be subject to, as always, time in the legislative programme. But we would hope to be able to make move on that in 2025.
Okay, thank you.
Just before we move on to homelessness and vulnerable young people, I'd just like to ask if you know what the rationale behind allowing first-time buyers' homes to be sold on the open market, and does this not just decrease available stock?
So this was basically, I assume, the 10-year rule, or has been the 5-year rule with existing developments. Yeah. I think the feeling was at the time, and it's long before my time, so I'm going back to sort of the 90s where this sort of policy developed, was the idea that it gets someone into a home, but then it also allows them to be able to move on in the future. And it was to encourage people into the housing market, because the worry was if you just fixed it at a first-time buyer's rate, how do they ever afford to get to the next stage if the next stage of housing has been continuously rising with the housing market? Because it will be moving more and more out of reach. Like I say, my personal view is there is ways around that, because you can actually still increase the first-time buyer's price by the average house price increase, so people remain on the same level but are able to save as well. I think, obviously it creates a finite situation, and I would support personally the introduction of a first-time buyers scheme where it remains first-time buyers.
Thank you.
So many people have argued that the island should adopt a two-tier housing market like that in Guernsey. Is this something that the board has looked into at all?
It's not so much something the board has looked into. I mean, I've looked at this, and I've also spoken to political colleagues down there in Guernsey. I'm not convinced it delivers the outcomes necessarily that it says on the tin it's supposed to. I'm not sure it's making that big a difference. And I always worry when you start creating two-tier marketplaces, it brings with it sometimes some unforeseen consequences as well, and very difficulties if people want to move on and sort of advancing themselves. So so it's not something that the board has considered, but I think we're more focused on, like I say, getting the schemes right and ensuring people can access the market at first base.
Okay, thank you.
Can you please provide us with an update on progress with the recommendations made by the Select Committee on Accommodation for Vulnerable Young People?
So in terms of care leavers, for instance, there's been a lot of work going on around that, in terms of ensuring that care leavers are continued to be supported after they leave care, and to ensure that they've got adequate housing. One of the biggest problems for care leavers was that it just became a cliff edge, to be blunt, and of course, as a former Minister for Health and Social Care, I probably know that more than most, because I was seeing it as Minister, where people just went out of the system and then they ended up sofa surfing or not really having any fixed abode. So the plan now is to allow care leavers to have some form of support, potentially certainly to 21, maybe up to 25, depending upon their individual needs and circumstances. You have some care leavers who don't require help and support. They're very independent. They go out into the world and everything's fine, but there is a strong cohort that needs support. Tim would recognise that, and that's what's being put in place, working with DHSC.
Housing Matters highlighted to us that vulnerable people under 18 often end up in bedsits, as you said, where they have fewer tenancy rights and can be asked to leave immediately. Is the board making any fixed plans to reform in this area?
So no is the answer in terms of reform at the moment in that area. It's not actually on the priority list. But I would go further and say what we need to do is prevent that happening to young people in the first place. Because ending up in a bedsit, it doesn't give you a stable life. It doesn't give you the opportunity to be able to get that base. So for me, reform isn't necessarily around your rights within a bedsit. Reform is in trying to stop people ending up in that situation and making sure that there's help and support there for them to be able to get into more stable accommodation. That's where I would want the focus to be, rather than trying to actually say, well, there's more rights within a bedsit environment. But I don't think that's the right environment for young people to be in.
So can you just clarify what your priority would be then?
So my priority there would be to work with DHSC and the Children and Families Division to ensure that we can actually, where there are children in need, we can develop a pathway to ensure that they can get more stable housing. I know the work that Carl and Housing Matters have been doing is absolutely fabulous in this area. They've helped an awful lot of young people. They've helped constituents of mine to find much more stable accommodation. But it's also about ensuring that even once they've actually got the stable accommodation, they've got somewhere to turn to if they need help and support to remain in that situation.
Can I just ask then, why hasn't the Housing and Communities Board looked into that?
The simple fact is it's time, and we can only do so much. I've got to be quite honest about it. If I had my way, the housing action plan will probably be about 100 different actions. So, we have a choice, which is we either do 100 things partly well and half done, or we focus on 10 or 12 things which we get fully done, implemented, that'll have an effect. I've got to be honest, that's what it is. And what we've decided to focus on is the things we believe would have the immediate effect for the most number of people, which is things like reviews of the shared equity schemes, ensuring that we get the tenants deposit scheme in place, the arbitration scheme in place, and that be quite frank, we start building social housing and actually building things that people can see and touch.
Would you not agree that there's more support for people that are going, I'm not saying it's good support, but for people going for the shared equity scheme than vulnerable young people who say have just left care and are looking to live somewhere other than a bedsit?
Well, in terms of the care, like I say, that is developing. That is one of the actions that I know DHSC is taking to actually reform. So there is work going on in that sphere. So when it comes to the vulnerable young people, there is a lot of work going on in that within Department of Health and Social Care. Young people in general is perhaps the bit that where there isn't a massive priority at the moment around that. But again, for me, it's about focus and ensuring we use our resources and what we have wisely. And for me, it's that vulnerable cohort who aren't necessarily just care leavers. They're also people who, for whatever reason, there's been a family breakdown and they can't remain in the home environment. They're the focus for me, because they're the ones that, if their life is disrupted, are most at risk.
And where does that scale on your priorities?
So in terms of the priority of the Housing Communities Board, and I know the priority of DHSC, it scales very highly. So like I say, I know there has been work going on to ensure that DHSC removes those cliff edges, particularly for care leavers, to ensure that they can actually get that support that they need.
And as a board, what is your top priority?
So the top priority for me is build housing. It might sound absolutely stupid, but the fact is, social housing has not really moved in terms of a build over the last 20 years or so. The number of social housing units has lagged behind growth in population and demand. That is within government's control, because we set the policy and we have overall administration in terms of being able to set the standards for other housing authorities to be able to drive that forward. And it hasn't happened over the last, like I say, 20 years or so. The OHAN shows very clearly we need 100 units potentially a year if we are just to keep level with demand between now and 2041. And in terms of affordable housing, there's been more affordable housing delivered under this administration than the previous one already, but it's still not enough. And we need to be looking at how we can utilise brownfield sites or sites under government's control to be able to provide that. So, like I say, it might sound an absolutely obvious priority for a Housing Communities Board, but for me the priority is to start building things that people can see, feel, touch and actually live in.
Okay, so firstly I'd just like to clarify, does the board have influence over public sector housing policy, or is that within the remit of the DOI?
No, so it comes through. So again, as with most of the policies, the way I'd describe it is the Housing Communities Board is an extra sensor check. So in terms, I've got to be very clear what the Housing Communities Board is and isn't. So for instance, it's not a department of government. In terms of officer support, I have roughly access to around about 3 officers to support the board that are directly related to the Housing Communities Board. The Division of Public Sector Housing sits within DOI, so they will go through and draw up the policy. It will then come through the Housing Communities Board to be sensor checked and whether we agree or not with it, and then it will go on to Council of Ministers and then ultimately Timward.
Okay, great, thank you. So the Housing and Communities Board was, of course, established to coordinate housing policy. Do you think this has been a success?
I actually think it has, because of the very fact we're here talking about it today, and I'm able to give evidence to you. Without the Housing Communities Board, I genuinely don't think we'd have had a homelessness strategy. Homelessness is something that has been talked about, or in fact not talked about as well, for about 20 years on this island, with sort of anecdotes about sofa surfing and there's never been any sort of context around it. The Housing Communities Board has been able to drive that forward and get the Isle of Man's first homelessness strategy in place at the end of last year. And I mean, it's still, even when I say it, takes a while for those words to sink in. The Isle of Man's first proper homelessness strategy, which we're only doing in 2023. That's quite phenomenal, to be honest, that it's taken that long. And also in relation to, again, the OHAN, I don't think that would be where it is now, showing us where we need to go up to 2041 if it wasn't for the existence of the Housing Communities Board. And I think some of the input the Housing Communities Board has had to some of the policies coming through DOI has been very positive as well. And I think, it's given also a point of engagement for other organisations. So for instance, last week, it was either last week or the week before, again I lose track of time, I met with Housing Matters. So they've now got a point within government, a political point they can actually come to discuss the broad range of housing policy, instead of having to go off to, say, for instance, DHSC if they want to talk about care leavers, or if they've got issues in relation to shared equity or public housing going to DOI. They can actually sort of grab me by the shoulder and say, come on, we need to have a chat about this. This is what we're seeing on the ground. And this is the other thing I think the Housing Communities Board has been able to do as well. It's been able to join up the third sector providers, so bring them into the mix as well and let them have a voice, because Housing Matters, the Salvation Army and Praxis, for instance, they have lots of experience there, much more experience than we could ever get in government with dealing with people on the ground, and we've been able to join that up as well. So I think actually it has been a success, and the next stage of the success needs to be actually delivering builds.
Have you faced any challenges at all?
I could probably talk to you about challenges until the weekend's over. There's been loads of challenges. The simple fact is housing data, as with most data across government, wasn't great. We relied generally on the census and what was coming back anecdotally. So we've had to build data sets, particularly around homelessness, from pretty much scratch. And I know certainly my predecessor in this role, Mr. Thomas, it was very keen on ensuring that the data was right, and quite rightly so, because how can you be sure that the decisions you're making are correct if you haven't got the data and proof to underpin that? There's been a huge amount of challenges, and funding is a challenge as well. Things cost money, even development of policy. So I think that has been the other challenge as well, ensuring that there is enough funding to move things forward.
Do you believe that the government is listening to your recommendations and effectively implementing the homelessness strategy or the HOHAN report?
I wouldn't be in this role if I didn't. I'm not known for being shy about expressing my opinion. And if I didn't believe government was listening, and I didn't believe there was the ability for me to make a difference in this job, then I wouldn't be doing it. I would have gone very vocally a long time ago. So I think government is. I think the frustration is sometimes how slowly things can move, and how much consideration has to go into certain things. I can tend generally be rather impatient and like to get things done a lot quicker than they sometimes can be, but I do think government is trying to move it on, and I think there is a recognition now of, like I say, what I've been banging on for years about, saying that housing underpins everything else. Get housing right, then you start unlocking everything else, like the economic strategy and the Ireland plan. Get housing wrong, you may as well just use it as waste paper.
So how do you ensure that the views of young people are represented in your decision making?
So one of the big ones is actually through people like yourselves. I think it's great that you've got this committee going, and I don't know if the board has already approached you for your views, but certainly one of the things I was discussing with the officers who administer the board was we want to hear from you. We actually want to hear from you as young people what you feel the top priorities are for you. So whatever you come out with as a committee, I can absolutely assure you the Housing Communities Board will be taking very seriously, because we need that sort of input. It's things like this that actually move things forward.
That's great. Have you considered appointing a youth representative on the board?
I must be honest, no. That isn't something we have considered. It's something I can take away and actually speak to other areas of government about, because that's a very good suggestion, actually.
Thank you very much.
I'd just like to ask on that point, why is that something that you would have never considered?
I think the reason being that what you can end up with is, the problem is the Housing Communities Board doesn't just deal with issues for young people, it deals with the wider. And the dilemma then comes, if you have a youth representative, do you have one about, do you have for instance, a disability representative, because we need to look at disabled housing and accessible housing? Do we need an older person's coordinator on the board as well to look at last time housing and where there's problems of downsizing? And before you know it, you can end up with a board that's bigger than Tynwald, to be frank.
I wouldn't necessarily say that a young person's a specific or niche thing to have.
No, I'm not saying it is a niche thing to have, but what I'm saying is you then start getting the arguments from different groups around, why aren't we represented, why aren't we? I mean, we did just go out, for instance, we do have lay members on the board, And we actually, in fact, at the moment we only have 2, but we're looking to expand that. And we recently did advertise, and there would have been nothing to stop a young person applying for that position. There was nothing, as far as I'm aware, in the application process that would have excluded a young person from going. We didn't get anyone, but certainly, like I say, it's something I'm more than happy to take away, because I think it could add a valuable different view.
I think the whole point of that question, I think, mainly is just to highlight how little young people are involved in government.
And also, I would encourage more young people to get involved in government. I've been around politics for a long time, and I'm from a local authority level to House of Keys, and I constantly urge when I go around the constituency, young people stand for election as well, get involved, because you need that different view range across the age groups.
Just before we finish up, would the board have any influence in speeding up the process of putting the secondary legislation into place for the private landlords bill?
So in terms of speeding up, no, because that is dependent upon the legislative timetable and the ability to have the regulations ready and going through to Tynwald. If you mean speeding up in terms of trying to move things along and saying, where are they, and can we get, we need to start moving on this, I can guarantee you I've already been doing that. I've been doing that since I came into post just under a year ago, because we do need to get them in place.
I think that's everything from us. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
Just to thank you for having me this afternoon, come along. And like I say, the invitation is there as well to come and talk to the Housing Communities Board. And I look forward to your final report and whatever may come from it.